Good morning, church. Everyone loves a good motivational speech. Ever since humans invented literature, we have been writing them down. And in preparation for this week, I read several famous ones throughout history, both from fiction and in nonfiction, and I wanted to share them all with you. But for the interest of time, I knew I needed to pick just one. And if you know me, you wouldn't be surprised that my first instinct was to read King Theoden's speech from The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. But I referenced Tolkien just a few weeks ago, so I'm going with Shakespeare today. I am not a professional actor, and I'm definitely not Sir Laurence Olivier or Kenneth Branagh. But I did watch their versions of Henry V's St. Crispin's Day speech, and I will give my best attempt. Now, in the context of this play, the day before a battle against the French army, who vastly outnumbered them, Henry V urged his men to fight valiantly so that they might be remembered in glory, especially on the anniversary of the battle, which was on the feast day of St. Crispin. And this is part of what he had to say to them. This day is called the Feast of St. Crispin. He who outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named, and arouse him at the name of St. Crispin. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, "Tomorrow is St. Crispin." Then he shall strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, "These wounds I had on Crispin's day." Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Tablet, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups, freshly remember it. This story the good man shall teach his son, and Crispian shall never go by. From this day to the ending of the world, be we in it, shall be remember it. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile. This day shall gentle his condition, and gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed that they were not here, and hold their manhood's chiefs while any speaks that fought with us on St. Crispin's Day. Now, I really recommend that you really just watch Laurence Olivier, because he did it so much better. He delivered that speech over the radio during World War II in order to boost British morale. Prime Minister Winston Churchill loved it so much that he personally asked Olivier to adapt it to film, which he did in 1944. And Churchill used that speech as inspiration for several of his own speeches, which are now considered famous themselves. A good speech can do a lot to convince a frightened people that to face whatever challenges are ahead of them, whether it is on the field of battle, whether it's on a sports field, in a classroom, or even in a church. As good as Shakespeare is, it's hard to beat God when it comes to motivational speeches. We're going to be looking at one of God's best speeches today as we look at the book of Joshua. If my slides can advance for us. We're making our way through a long series of lessons called The Story, which is guiding us through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And if you've missed it so far, that's okay, because it's all part of the overarching story being told by God and which continues to unfold today. This is our story too, and we all have a place in it. And today's lesson is the story of a wall. Last week we read about how after the Exodus, the Israelites refused to cross the Jordan into the Promised Land because their enemies there were too powerful for them in their eyes. They decided it would be better to go back to slavery in Egypt rather than to trust God to lead them into the promised land of Canaan. And in anger and frustration, God told them that if they didn't want to cross, they weren't going to. Israel was made to wander in the wilderness for 40 years before that whole generation died. And then their children and grandchildren were given a chance. Moses was among those who died in the wilderness, and Joshua was appointed as his successor. But Joshua didn't just have huge shoes to fill, but a mighty task ahead of him, the whole conquest of Canaan. Remember the 12 spies that went out to explore the land? Joshua was one of them. He saw the fortified cities that the Canaanites lived in with his own eyes. He remembered Jericho. There were a lot of reasons that Joshua had to not only be skeptical, but to be downright fearful. But before any of his anxiety or apprehension could kick in, Joshua received the following words from God. This is how the book of Joshua begins, with a motivational speech. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the great desert of Lebanon, from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give to them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate it on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. I can hear the stirring motivational music, maybe a slow clap, as Joshua realized that he could absolutely do this. What God had repeated to Joshua became a rallying cry for Israel. Be strong and courageous. With strength and courage, Joshua finally led God's people across the Jordan River into the promised land. Unlike their parents and grandparents, they did cross the Jordan, which God not so coincidentally parted like he did with the Red Sea 40 years earlier. God was with them then, and God was with them now. The waters stopped flowing as soon as the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant reached the river's edge. And the Ark, which was typically in the tabernacle, was God's presence among God's people. It was a visual reminder of what God had told them, that God will be with you wherever you go. And the Ark is what did Jericho's mighty walls in, as our kids demonstrated earlier. Most of you are familiar with the story of the Battle of Jericho. For 6 days, they marched around the city with the Ark of the Covenant without saying a word, with only 7 priests blowing 7 trumpets. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times, and when the priests sounded their trumpets one final time, Joshua commanded them, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." And they did, and the walls crumbled before them. Jericho was a landmark victory, not for Joshua, not for the Israelites, but for God. But Joshua knew this already, because of what had happened to him right before the battle. At the end of Joshua 5, there's a particularly weird incident that I've never really paid much attention to, because it's just a few verses sandwiched right before the Battle of Jericho. See, right after they crossed into Canaan, the Israelites celebrated Passover. But unlike they had done so for the last 40 years, they didn't eat manna. They ate from the food of the land that they were in now, which was emphasized 3 times. They ate the grain of the promised land. But then we get this. In verse 13 of chapter 5, we read that now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied. "But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. We don't know who this man was, whether he was an actual person, an angel, or just a vision, and neither did Joshua. All Joshua saw was that he had a sword drawn, and that Joshua wanted to know whether or not this man was a threat to him. Are you on my side or their side? That's a question humans ask a lot, and we are asked a lot, and it's one that can cause an awful lot of anxiety. Are you on my side or their side? Human tends to see the world as this and that, black or white, good or bad, Michigan or Michigan State, or Ohio State. I'm not going to get into there. Sports teams' alliances they're easy to joke around about. But we've got an election coming up in a few weeks, and once again we're seeing that our country and our community is split among a sharp divide. We are continually being made to choose a side, and we have built up a wall, and we are asking each other, which side of the wall are you on? We ask this question about so many things. Are you on my side or on their side? Joshua asked a simple question to this man. Are you on our side or on our enemy's side? Are you for Israel or are you for Jericho? But the stranger rejected Joshua's binary, dichotomous thinking. He just replied, "No." How is that an answer to his question? No? I bet that answer startled Joshua, because if this man wasn't willing to say that he was on Joshua's side, then clearly he had to be on the enemy's side, right? But the man continued. He was on God's side, coming as a commander of the army of the Lord. Well, that means he must have been on Joshua's side, right? No, that's not what he said. Because that's the wrong way of thinking about God. God isn't on anyone's side. God is on God's side. On the eve of this momentous battle, the first victory in the land of Canaan, Joshua was given this humbling reminder that God wasn't on Joshua's side, but Joshua was on God's side. And if this battle was to be fought and won, it would be done so not by Joshua, not by Israel, but by God. Now, throughout human history, it can be said that in any war between nations, God is the first to be drafted. Both sides of a battle will charge in at each other, declaring, "God is on our side." Now, Henry V clearly believed so, but I bet the French army that he was fighting probably didn't agree with Henry. They would have said, "God is on our side." So what does it mean then for us to be on God's side? God makes it pretty clear. And we see it right in the middle of that motivational speech at the beginning of Joshua 1. Be strong and courageous as you carefully obey God's law and do not turn from it. Keep it on your lips. Think about it. Meditate on it daily. Always consider what it means to do what God wants you to do, and then boldly do it. As we'll see as the story continues, in time, Israel forgot about this. They strayed from God and God's goodness and suddenly found that God wasn't by their side anymore. Their enemies would have devastating victories over them. We'll see that especially next week with the book of Judges. The stories of Joshua were passed down orally for generations, but it likely wasn't written down in the form that we have it now until centuries later during the Babylonian exile when God's people were at their lowest. Driven out from the promised land. They could no longer live in the land that God had given and that which Joshua had spent so long conquering. We saw that this summer as we studied the prophets who warned that this was Israel's consequence for walking away from God and the way that God had called them to live. They were no longer living justly and they were no longer living good. Israel had learned the hard way. One lesson that God's people must never forget. It wasn't that God had left them or forsaken them, which He had promised He would never do, but that they had left and forsaken God. They were no longer on God's side. God's people have always had to ask this important question: are we on God's side? Are we doing God's will? For a couple of weeks, we've been talking about the law of Moses, which Jesus said could be summed up in its entirety with two simple commands, which I've had on here on this stage for years. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Are we doing those things? Because if we aren't loving our neighbor as ourselves, we cannot claim to love God and to be on God's side. Well, unfortunately, then, loving is very easy, isn't it? It's really easy to... No, it's not. Not always. In fact, showing love often requires that we are strong and courageous and unafraid. Because sometimes love is very risky and dangerous. I haven't mentioned Rahab yet, but you can't talk about Jericho without talking about her. She lived in Jericho, right on that wall, and she was on the wrong side of it. She was a prostitute that saved two spies that Joshua had sent into the city, hiding them from the king and lowering them over that wall to safety. And she was hailed as a hero, not by her own people, but by the people of Israel. And Joshua made sure to save her and her family from Jericho's destruction, but she was not an Israelite. She was not one of God's people. She was not a descendant of Abraham. She wasn't on Israel's side. But she just simply did what was right, even at great risk to herself. She showed love and compassion long before she even knew who the God of Israel was, but God knew her. Rahab was on God's side even if she didn't know it. And so Rahab became an honorary Israelite and is listed as one of the ancestors of Jesus himself. She's mentioned in Hebrews 11's Hall of Faith. We remember Rahab. And that is news that Jesus came to proclaim. That it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what country you are from, who your family is, what your DNA test reveals. It doesn't matter what side of the wall you are on. You can be on God's side. God is in the business of demolishing walls. which is very good news for us because most of us are Gentiles, just like Rahab. We were on the wrong side of the wall. But as Ephesians 2 tells us, Jesus destroyed the barrier. He destroyed the dividing wall of hostility that separated us, reconciling all people to himself through the cross. And this is very good news for us and for the entire world. Through Jesus, God's side became even vaster than imaginable, and God's kingdom continues to grow. Meanwhile, humans try to rebuild these walls, and we try to restack these barriers, but God is on the side of peace and reconciliation. God is continually ridding the world of these us versus them divisions that have caused so much hurt in this world by uniting all people under God's grace and love. That is God's side. Are we on it? For this is the gospel that we are preaching, and the good news we are proclaiming not just with our words, but with our lives. We are doing so through boldly and courageously and fearlessly demonstrating God's love and mercy and peace. May the world know it, because God knows the world needs it. Do you? If you are in need of God's love, we have very good news for you. There are no barriers, no walls between you and God. There is nothing that can separate you from God's love. No person in this world, no human, can ever do that. You can be baptized into Christ today. You can join God's side, and God won't just be by your side. God's Spirit will be within you always. And if you are in need of encouragement, if you are in need of prayer, if God can minister to you through us, whether it's one of our elders or one of our Stephen ministers, we can pray for you right now. Just let us know. And in all things, may God and God alone receive all glory and honor and praise. Amen.